Thank you so much for joining us, Tim, and I was so intrigued with some of the stories and images, and I took down pages and pages of notes. However, we're going to focus maybe a little more in depth on only 6 or 7 of the topics. And one of them that I found interesting that I have not heard people speak about is the notion that it's not just reverse engineered craft that have happened around the world, but you say the truth is since the 70s, we've been, I think you said the 70s, we have actually been experimenting with and flying alien craft directly.
I think even earlier than that, actually.
Talk about this phenomenon.
My information comes from several sources. One is a former Army intelligence officer whom I've known for very many years, and he's a very trusty aerospace journalist. And he indicated to me that from the mid-50s, we were developing alien technology, and we had mastered alien technology in a relatively short time. That was quite surprising, apparently. And we also have been given actual craft by certain aliens who have our best interests at heart. We have been given the technology and the craft, and we have been flying them for a very long time. That is my information. And even Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, whom I knew, we corresponded. I think we spoke on the phone probably once, but according to a friend of his who I know and trust implicitly, well, it's known that Gordon Cooper became very frustrated with the way the United Nations ignored the subject back in 1978. There was a meeting, I think, in Florida, a Florida branch of the United Nations, and he was very, very unhappy about it. And he said, "What does it take? Do I have to fly one of these craft and land it outside the United Nations building in New York?" He was actually prepared to do that.
He wasn't joking.
No. I thought it was a joke until this friend said no, he was being absolutely serious, because quite a number of the astronauts have been flying these craft. There is a real space program.
Yes.
And there is a cover space program, which is the NASA space program.
Exactly.
My information is, for example, that United States Air Force Space Command is actually in charge of the proper space program. And this information comes via Paul LaViolette, who's an excellent writer.
Yes, I know Paul LaViolette.
And he's a physicist.
Yes.
And he gets hold of some very good information, and we get on well. And I've only met him once, but he's a very bright lad.
Yes, he is. He's a good researcher.
And he said he was told that the US Air Force Space Command had a base in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somewhere. They've got a huge shuttle fleet that goes regularly to the moon and to Mars, apparently. And I don't disbelieve him.
Well, and I believe it was Neil Armstrong that said there were other spacecraft and things on the moon.
Well, that was actually picked up and recorded.
Yes, it was.
I think the Russians at least had picked it up. And so it's, you know, it's a matter of fact. But I had a friend called Pamela Hanford who was in MI6. I'd known her for many years. She's passed away now, which is why she allowed me to use her name for the first time, because the story actually came out in my first book, Above Top Secret, but I couldn't mention her name because of her background. But in any event, she was invited. She participated in a I would think a restricted NASA conference in 1984 in Anacapri in Italy. And her bedroom adjoined that of Neil Armstrong, and the bedroom beyond that was Buzz Aldrin. And she says she overheard. I'm quite sure she bugged their rooms.
Well, if she's MI6, likely she had the
as
technology.
They do. And she overheard this conversation with a German professor, Professor Schwarz, saying, "Tell us what, come on, you know, tell us what really happened on the moon." And he said, "Oh, it was dreadful. We got there and there were these spaceships and they were menacing and everything, and Pamela got all this." And so at cocktails later on that day or the next day, I forget which, she accosted Armstrong and said, "Oh, by the way, you know, can you tell me more about what went on the moon? And he told her, and he said, yeah, we were very frightened. It was very, very disturbing. There were two large menacing.
I see, menacing looking craft.
They found it menacing. And he said that was it. It was just a short hop, and that was it. And so that's the cover space program,
that's
which is NASA, in my opinion.
There's so much contradictory information coming out about the moon in general, about the moon landing. There was even claims that there was a secondary film made of the moon landing that did not show and implicate all these other things involved.
I wouldn't be
because
surprised,
you believe that's true.
I don't know, but it sounds likely.
Yes, I mean, Stanley Kubrick was supposedly involved and was open about this, and films have been made on this. And it would be it would make sense if what they actually found up there was the other.
Yes.
To have an alternate version of that.
And Pamela also told me that the United States has been in regular communication with a planet. She didn't reveal to me what planet. She just said a planet.
So when they found these menacing-looking structures or ships on the moon, craft on the moon, did they view whatever that might be associated with as a potential threat to humanity?
That's what they felt. I don't know about that, but they certainly, sure as hell, thought it was a threat to them.
Interesting, because we spoke earlier, touched on for a moment the fact that there are some forces that are not working in the best interest of humanity involved in these hybridization programs.
Definitely.
And so you're saying, and who knows if those were involved, if those had anything to do with that or not, but the sense that they had of danger is kind of interesting, because some of these men, we know Gordon Cooper and Edgar Mitchell, were also very intuitive and open men as well. So I find that link interesting.
Sure.
And so these spacecraft have been loaned to us, so to speak, from off-planet cultures, so that we would be able to get up to speed in the technology
some of them have been just
to defend ourselves?
Yes. In some, I mean, we actually developed the technology probably from captured craft quite early on.
Yes.
But I think things improved from the mid-1950s, according to my information, that we were actually being given some craft and technology. So we've got highly advanced craft that are being flown by our guys, and that's been going on in Italy, for example. Professor Stefano Breccia told me that he was aware of. He told me this 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago. Yeah, I think it was, and he said that that there were craft that were being flown by 10 to 15 Italian Air Force pilots. And he gave me some funny stories about them because they've been flying, they were trained by the alien group, the Amicizia group, over a lengthy period. But actually the craft are very easy to fly.
I remember you saying that, much easier than what we've come up with. Our technology is so primitive relatively.
To such an extent, Stefano's a pilot, a qualified pilot, and he said he just found it boring. And he just made notes on his Olivetti typewriter sitting in the flying saucer.
Interesting.
With a German pilot.
Interesting. Talk a little bit about the Amicizia group, the friendship group, and what that was about.
Amicizia started in the mid-1950s. In Italy it was called Amicizia, and the Italians were the first to publish information about it. But in fact it was going on in many countries. In the former Soviet Union. And Stefano himself had addressed the Academy of Soviet Academy of Sciences at one time as a scientist on his particular specialities and things, not about the alien situation. But he said there were people, Russians were being dealt with that were communicating with aliens. There, as far away as Chile, there was Friendship Isle in Chile. It wasn't called Amicizia, so the people in Chile were well aware that was going on, some of them. And I think I'm well aware at that period of time, the 1950s, mid-1950s, contacts were building up with individuals in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Russia, in Australia, many, many countries around the world. So I think it's a much larger process than we might imagine.
And that was a very profound period of time for contact in general. And let's pick it up with President Eisenhower now that we're into the 50s, because that's fascinating.
I think it's no coincidence that 1955 was the point that we were actually close to blowing ourselves up with hydrogen bombs. There was a tit-for-tat going on, Russian tests of hydrogen bombs, not atomic bombs, and the Americans were doing it. And the aliens said, enough is enough, and they arranged for this meeting to take place at Holloman Air Force Base in February of 1955, and it did take place. The only problem is we don't have any information that's available to me, at any rate, yet, of what actually. But all I know, it was a half-hour meeting. Eisenhower was taken on board their saucer.
Okay, now let's back up a bit.
Let's back up. Okay.
Now, so Art Campbell did quite a bit of research in this, right?
Art Campbell did tremendous amount of research, and let me use.
Tell the cover story of it, from what Art said. The cover story of where Eisenhower said he was going all
Yes.
the way through to what happened.
Yeah, there was Eisenhower made a statement to the effect that he was going for a few days quail shooting with the Treasury Secretary, and you know, he'd be back fine. And he took a whole plane load of people, including Mamie, his wife, and a lot of other people. The plane went out there. And within a few hours, a message went out that he'd caught a case of the snuffles. So he was going to go to bed and sleep it off overnight and everything. In actual fact, he flew in Air Force One to Holloman Air Force Base for this secret arranged meeting with relatively few people on board the plane. People, trusted people, like I mentioned Leo Barrega, who was one of the security guards who'd served several presidents.
And so he went aboard a craft?
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't know what was said.
We only know, as evidence when he was leaving office, that he was fully aware that some program had been co-opted because of his famous statement
military-industrial speech
of the military-industrial complex.
Sure.
So in Art Campbell, of course, he wasn't there. So
No.
is that lost, the knowledge of what happened on board that craft with the president?
I doubt it. I'm trying to think of a retiring American source. He's in my book. I've just forgotten his name. Who came out just I think about a year and a half ago with information saying that he'd seen top secret documents relating to Eisenhower's meetings, plural, with extraterrestrials. Because we know there were two in 1954 at what used to be called Muroc Airfield. It's now Edwards Air Force Base. In fact, a year or so afterwards, it was called, I think, Edwards Air Force Base. And Eisenhower had at least one meeting there, which was attended by a number of distinguished people, Archbishop of Los Angeles and all sorts of people were there, and I've reproduced the actual document that in my book where he gives the names of some of the people that were with him, quite high-ranking people. And there was another meeting at either at that same Air Force Base or somewhere else. I'm not absolutely quite sure, but there was a lot going on at that time.
Now, what about not preceding him after, when Kennedy came into office? Because there are a lot of different stories about Kennedy wanting to be more on a need-to-know basis, and there were certain events that occurred.
Correct. My information is that the controversial guy George Adamski, who's much maligned, actually had a US government ordinance passed which gave him clearance to all military bases throughout the world, all United States military bases.
I understand.
He also had clearance to go to the White House at any time, where he met Kennedy. I think he met other presidents as well, and he certainly went to the Vatican on probably 3 occasions.
No, so he met with the Pope, he met with presidents.
He met with Pope John XXIII twice.
Yes.
And it was a private meeting, and the Pope gave him that medal. And earlier than that, I think it was, I forget which Pope it was, Pius.
Do we know the nature of his conversations at all with Kennedy or any of the others?
No, we don't. All we know is that Adamski arranged for Kennedy to be taken on board one of the large cigar-shaped craft, and that was arranged.
Is that documented somewhere in some classified file?
I would think so.
See, now that I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. Well, Adamski seems to have been really key. And as I said to to Glenn Steckling when we were talking, there's something about just looking at Adamski, just looking at his picture before I even knew anything about the man.
Something about him,
There's
isn't there?
something about him that has this grace that's hard to describe. There's
Yeah.
an extra quality to him.
Yeah.
And so it appears he was highly influential behind the scenes for many, many years.
Yeah. And my frustration was that I was supposed to be meeting him in 1963. I was touring with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And it was weird, actually, in a way.
Why?
I never got to meet him. But before we got to Los Angeles, we were in a convoy of 3 coaches, the orchestra, from Tucson to Los Angeles. I think the thing's about 500 and something miles.
It's a distance, yes.
And we had a cafe stop for an hour. And I was wondering whether I'd get the chance to see Adam. I thought, you know, what about our rehearsal schedule, you know, and I have to go up to Palomar and everything. I think there could, you know, I was worrying about it all. Anyway, we sat down in this restaurant, and I was with 3 of my colleagues in a sort of corner area, but not far from the line. And I saw waiting in line, I was alerted, a very petite girl, very attractive, but very, very calm and difficult to describe, really. Very, very collected.
That extra presence of grace?
Yes, not like, sort of like a ballet dancer almost, but she wasn't very tall. And in my mind I thought, you're one of them. So I sent out the thought, if you're from elsewhere, could you pass by my table and give me some proof? She came to our table with a deadpan look on her face, and then she went.
Is that what you asked her to do telepathically?
Not.
You just said to give her something, a clue.
Yes.
How amazing.
And my colleague said, what's that all about, Tim? Where did you pick her up from? And I said, no. And when she left, it was completely deadpan expression. I realized that was the end of it. She went to another part of the restaurant.
And knowing what you know, and we've only touched on a half a dozen of many, many topics here. In short, for you, what is, from everything you have access to, the greatest hope in all of this and the greatest concern in all of this?
My greatest hope is that via the Amicizia project, if you like, which took place in many countries around the world involving lots of people, they have been given an insight into a more advanced civilization, a civilization probably thousands of years in advance of ours. But the downside of that, as it was admitted by the Amicizia aliens themselves, was that there are others who they had to deal with. They called them the contrari in Italian, the ones that they fought together. I mean, there were all sorts of extraordinary things going on. In 1978, when officially they claimed to be leaving, the Adriatic Sea went into absolute turmoil. Several fishermen were killed, I believe. And
was this part of a fight
according
of some
to
kind?
Yes, there was an undersea battle being waged, apparently, between these contrari, if you like.
And are most of them in the sea? These beings that you're talking about?
The bases?
These bases
no,
in the sea?
they had, for example, a base in the north of the Abruzzi region, which was about 184 miles long. These bases, you think, gosh, they got guys, you know, with things. They can be created in seconds. They have the technology to compact matter, and when they compact matter, it makes the surround much more solid.
Interesting.
Think of it. And then when they leave, they just close it all in again.
And what is their agenda? According to the Amicizia group?
According to the Amicizia group, to help us to progress and to help them deal with the situation from aliens, other aliens who do not have our best interests at heart. That is where the problem lies.
And we'll leave it at that, because we've had many conversations with different people talking about this, and I appreciate your perspectives on it, and thank you so much for sharing your personal encounters as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.